Hey there. Tonight we're taking a slow step back into a story you think you know. One that's been whispered to you since childhood, tucked into pages with gilded letters and pastel illustrations. A story about a beautiful girl, a spinning wheel, a deep sleep and a kiss. Maybe it helped you sleep once, or maybe it made you dream of castles with ivy-covered towers and a prince who always shows up right on time. But here's the curious thing about bedtime stories. They often keep their darkest truths hidden under all those soft blankets. Only if you'd like to, you can settle in and follow along. This is just one of many sleepy stories we share here. Stories that reveal the quiet corners of history, the ones tucked between the official lines. If you enjoy drifting through tales that are strange true, and softly told, you're welcome to subscribe, or follow no pressure at all. For now, just breathe easy, get comfortable, and let's gently unravel the first thread of a fairy tale that's far older and stranger than it seemed. You don't begin in a tower or even at a cradle. You begin in a library in a quiet room somewhere in Germany around the year 1812. Two brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, are collecting old folk tales, not for entertainment, but for preservation. They're scholars, not storytellers, and yet what they publish becomes bedtime reading for generations. Among their many tales is one that would later become known to the world as Sleeping Beauty. But what many forget is that this version was never their own invention. It was an edited, softened retelling of stories passed down orally for centuries. The Grimm version, though still darker than modern retellings, had already been trimmed of its thorns. The princess doesn't suffer. The prince is gallant, the curse is clear, and the ending is neat. But if you look at the early renditions before Grimm, before Charles Perrault, even before Basile, you find something different. Versions where things aren't so tidy. Versions where the princess is not just asleep, but silenced. Where time doesn't merely stop, it folds in on itself. In Grimm's 1812 edition, the tale is titled Little Briar Rose, a name chosen perhaps to soften the sharp edges of the bramble hedge that surrounds her. The story opens with a childless king and queen who, after years of longing, are finally promised a daughter by a frog. Yes, a frog. Not a fairy, not a goddess, just a frog in the royal bathtub. This peculiar creature, in its raspy little voice, declares that the queen shall bear a child within the year. And sure enough, the queen does. Now, this part often gets skipped in the children's versions, but frogs, especially in European folklore, aren't always cute. They were symbols of fertility, yes, but also of transformation, disease, and prophecy. To have one appear in your bath wasn't always a blessing. Still, the royal couple rejoices, and soon their daughter is born a girl so beautiful that the king is overcome with joy. He orders a grand feast in her honor and invites all the wise women of the kingdom. Well, almost all of them. You see, the king has only 12 golden plates, and there are 13 wise women. So with the logic of royal accounting, he decides to invite just 12, omitting the 13th entirely. It's a tiny detail, a missing dish. But in folklore, details are everything. That one slight sets off the entire story. The 13th woman, furious at the snub, arrives anyway, and declares that on the girl's 15th birthday, she will prick her finger on a spindle and die. This moment is often framed as the eruption of jealousy or pride. But from another angle, it's a reminder: leave someone out, and you may invite more than silence. The act of forgetting, whether by accident or design, has consequences. Fortunately, the 12th wise woman still has her gift to give. She can't undo the curse, but she can soften it. Instead of death, the princess will fall into a deep sleep for 100 years. A long pause, but not the end. And so the king, bless him, responds with every parent's favorite impulse: total control. He orders every spindle in the kingdom destroyed. Every last one. Burned, confiscated, locked away. It's not just a precaution, it's a quiet panic. He hopes to outsmart fate by eliminating its tool. But as you'll come to see, fate rarely obeys royal decrees. Here's something curious. The idea of spindles and spinning isn't just decorative. In the early 1800s, spindles still represented domestic work womanhood and the passage into maturity. They were more than tools, they were thresholds. To spin meant to create, to transform fibers into thread, to shape the future. So when the princess eventually touches that spindle, she isn't just clumsy. She's stepping into a different role, a different identity, and yes, a different danger. Historians still debate the origin of this motif. Some argue that it traces back to ancient fertility rites. Others say it evolved alongside the practical risks of household work in the Middle Ages. But either way, the symbolism stuck. The spindle is both creator and curse. And here's a lovely little tidbit. The Grimm version doesn't explain why there are only 12 golden plates. It just is. But in some oral versions, there's a quiet undertone that the 13th wise woman lived apart from the others, perhaps shunned, perhaps feared, not just excluded, but erased, which casts her entrance not as a tantrum, but as a reckoning. So what do you have so far? A princess born from a frog's whisper, a feast spoiled by arithmetic, a forgotten guest who speaks a future no one wants to hear, and a girl whose destiny is both delayed and declared before she even speaks her first word. And yet, as you settle into this story, you realize it's not about evil, or even magic. It's about time, how it stretches curls and sometimes stops altogether. One forgotten invitation becomes a century of sleep. One moment of touch becomes a lifetime of silence. And all of it is wrapped in roses. There's a reason this tale survived centuries of retelling. It taps into something deeper than fear. It reflects what happens when innocence, beauty, and passivity are idealized all at once. A girl is born. She's loved. She's protected. And then she's placed on pause until someone else decides it's time to wake up. But not yet. She hasn't touched the spindle. Not yet. You might be tempted to think that great misfortunes begin with thunderclaps or wicked laughter, with lightning forks across castle walls, or the hiss of some venomous spell. But no, sometimes all it takes is a single oversight. One missing place setting. One golden plate too few. That's where the curse of Sleeping Beauty truly begins. Not with darkness, but with dinner. You see, after the birth of the beautiful princess, the king, flushed with paternal joy, wants to show off. He arranges a lavish feast, something grand enough to mark not just her arrival, but the promise she represents youth, future fortune. He invites everyone who matters, including the wisest women in the kingdom, figures of magic knowledge and deep-rooted tradition. These are not ordinary guests. Their presence is both honor and insurance. There are 13 of them, and yet only 12 golden plates. That's the logistical hiccup. And instead of commissioning a 13th, or borrowing from the royal silverware, the king simply decides to invite 12. No explanation offered, just a simple cut to the list. Now, in everyday life, such a thing might cause a bit of gossip, maybe an awkward encounter at the next town event. But in the realm of folklore, especially when dealing with women gifted with ancient wisdom and perhaps a touch of divine power, exclusion is never just social. It's symbolic. Being left out isn't merely being forgotten, it's being erased. And so as the 12 wise women file in, each bearing gifts, virtue, beauty, kindness, grace, there's a tension in the air, a sense that something or someone has been left behind. The 12th woman hasn't even finished speaking when the 13th arrives. Not with a cloak or a wand, not riding wind or smoke, just a presence uninvited and unmistakably wronged. She doesn't shout. She doesn't rage. She simply makes a statement. When the princess turns 15, she will prick her finger on a spindle and fall down as if dead. Then she disappears. There's no fire, no storm, just silence. The kind of silence that takes the air out of the room. It's easy to paint her as the villain. She's angry, dramatic, even vindictive. But what if you pause for a moment and look at it differently? What if she wasn't punishing the child, but reminding everyone else what happens when tradition is dismissed, when a voice is ignored, when power is treated like a party trick? This is where the 12th wise woman steps in. Her blessing remains unspoken until now. With calm urgency, she adjusts the course of fate. The princess will not die, only sleep, for 100 years. It's not a cure, but a cushion. Here's a small but fascinating footnote from the history of folktales. In some Eastern European variations, the number of wise women isn't fixed. Sometimes it's 7, sometimes 9. But what remains constant is this pattern many bless. One curses, one softens. It's a triad, a cycle, a rhythm that echoes ancient mythologies, where fate is divided among sisters. Like the fates of Greek legend, who spun, measured, and ultimately cut the thread of every human life. Historians still debate where the golden plate detail came from. Some suggest it was a way to insert a believable human mistake into a story full of enchantment, a moment of real-world practicality that made the tale more relatable. Others argue it was a subtle jab at royal foolishness, a kingdom of gold, and yet too stingy to make one more dish. And here's an even stranger tidbit. Golden plates actually held ceremonial significance in some medieval courts. They were used in christening feasts and rites of passage. To eat from one was a mark of divine favor. So perhaps the story is hinting at more than just a logistical error. Perhaps the 13th woman didn't just want dinner. She wanted recognition, equal status, and a seat at the sacred table. The king, in his panic, does what kings often do. He tries to legislate against fate. He sends out a decree banning all spinning wheels, ordering them destroyed. In a kingdom built on cloth and thread, this is no small feat. Spinning was a daily activity for countless women. It was their livelihood, their craft, and in many ways their place in the social order. To burn the spindles wasn't just a precaution. It was a disruption of life itself. In folklore, spindles have long been symbols of feminine power. Not power in the explosive, magical sense, but the quiet, enduring kind. The kind that creates thread from raw fiber, that weaves blankets and banners and bandages. The kind that sustains empires. To outlaw the spindle was to outlaw womanhood's oldest task. And yet, as you'd expect, the one spindle that mattered wasn't found. It sat quietly in a forgotten tower, untouched by decree or fire waiting. Because stories like fate have a way of circling back. In modern retellings, this whole part is breezed through. The curse is cast, the wheel appears, and the girl pricks her finger. But here, in this slower telling, you begin to see the depth of the setup, the overconfidence of power, the consequences of erasure, the illusion of control. And while the king believes he has eliminated the danger, all he's done is delay it. 100 years of sleep may seem like mercy, but it's also a kind of stasis, an interruption, a holding pattern for a life that never got to begin. It's also worth noting that in some versions of the tale, the princess doesn't prick her finger at all. Sometimes it's her heel. Sometimes it's a splinter under the nail. Each variation adds new texture, but the result is always the same, a sudden stillness. Not death, not quite, but close enough to scare everyone else into silence. Why does this moment matter? Because it's the turning point where the story stops being about a girl and starts being about everything around her. The world reorganizes itself in response to her pause. Not her choices, not her actions, just her condition. She sleeps, and so must everyone else. And what of the 13th wise woman, the one with no name? She vanishes from the story after her curse. She doesn't show up later, doesn't gloat or seek revenge. Her role is singular, to interrupt, to challenge, and to vanish, which in a way mirrors how society has treated certain voices throughout history, acknowledged only when disruptive, then quickly erased again. If you pull back for a moment, it becomes clear that this tale isn't just about one girl and a spinning wheel. It's about the consequences of overlooking, of ignoring, of failing to make room. A single missing plate becomes a century of silence. That's the quiet genius of folktales. They fold big truths into small gestures. A frog in a bath, a spindle in a tower, a guest not invited. And through it all, the suggestion that maybe the curse was never magical at all. Maybe it was just history repeating itself softly, patiently, like a thread winding itself around your finger. And so the girl grows up. Kind, gentle, beautiful, everything you'd expect from a princess. But also curious. On the eve of her 15th birthday, she finds herself alone in the castle, her footsteps echoing on stone. She's never seen a spinning wheel. She doesn't even know what it is. But there, in an old tower, she finds one. Old, rusted, forgotten, like the 13th woman herself. She vanishes, leaving behind only the echo of her words as sharp and pointed as the spindle she foretold. And you already know what happens next. It happens quietly, the way most life-altering moments tend to do. One moment you're tracing your fingers across the smooth curve of a spindle wheel, curious, unknowing, and the next your body has gone still. Your eyes flutter closed and time simply slips away from you. She doesn't scream. There's no crash, no drama, just the faint sting of a fingertip, meeting polished wood, the whisper of a spindle's point against skin, and then silence. She folds gently into herself onto a dusty old bed nearby as if she were only resting, not retreating into a sleep that would last generations. In the versions passed down through centuries, this moment is described in soft terms. She fell as if dead, they say, but as if changes everything. She isn't gone, just paused, suspended, like fruit still on the branch long after harvest season has ended. And here the story shifts again, because the curse isn't only hers to bear. With her fall, something vast and invisible spreads across the castle. The spell, once triggered, begins to hum through the stones. The cook drops his ladle mid-stir. The guards nod off mid-stride. Horses in the stable stop mid-trot, mid-neigh. Even the wind at the windows seems to hush itself, unsure whether it too must now wait. The king and queen, newly returned to the palace, collapse in the throne room, hands still reaching for one another. The fire freezes mid-flicker embers suspended in their glow. A leaf already halfway fallen from a branch in the courtyard stops mid-air and stays there, trembling slightly in the stillness. The entire world of the princess, every soul, every flicker of movement sinks into sleep. And outside, the castle begins to vanish, not in a puff of smoke or a magician's trick, but slowly, quietly under nature's hand. Thorny vines creep over the gates. Brambles wind around stone. Ivy claims the windows inch by inch. By the time the sun rises again, the castle is no longer visible from the road. It becomes a rumor. There's something beautifully eerie about that. Not just the image of a sleeping world, but the idea that memory itself might slumber too. That something once grand, once beloved, could vanish so completely that even its name begins to fade. But some stories are too strange to disappear entirely. Word spreads quietly about a forgotten castle and a girl asleep inside. About the thorns that grow thicker every year, sharp enough to tear through steel, deep enough to swallow men whole. And always the same detail: a princess waits in a tower untouched by time. This is where suitors come in, of course. Princes from neighboring lands, brave or foolish, or simply eager to be remembered. They hear the legend. They gather their swords, mount their horses, and head for the brambles. Some don't make it past the first vine. Others vanish deeper in their armor, glinting for a moment before it's lost to green shadows. But not all the versions of the story are so grim. Some say the vines themselves are only dangerous while the curse still holds. That after the 100 years pass exactly to the day the thorns wither into roses, that the next prince to arrive doesn't have to fight his way through it all. He simply walks, as if some quiet force has been waiting for him. Historians still argue whether this 100-year motif has a practical origin. Some suggest it reflects the idea of generational forgetting, or the transition of power between monarchies. Others see it as a remnant of ancient seasonal myths, cycles of life, death, and rebirth. The princess sleeps like the land in winter, and then she blooms. In fact, the concept of the sleeping kingdom appears in multiple cultures. In Welsh legend, King Arthur and his knights are said to sleep beneath a mountain, waiting for Britain's darkest hour. In Serbian folklore, entire armies lie dormant in caves, destined to rise again when the land needs them. Sleep here is not an end but a waiting room, and the girl at the center of it all, she is preserved. She does not age or decay. Her cheeks stay flushed, her hair, ungraying her dress, unrumpled. It's as if the world wrapped her in cellophane and placed her gently on a shelf. A frozen moment untouchable. This preservation isn't just magic, it's symbolism. In medieval Christian tradition, incorruptibility was considered a sign of divine favor. Saints whose bodies did not decompose were believed to have lived lives of extraordinary purity. Their flesh, miraculously untouched by time, was displayed in glass coffins, kissed by pilgrims, venerated by the church. The idea that Sleeping Beauty's body remained perfect for 100 years without a single mark or blemish isn't just romantic, it's theological. She is not just beautiful. She is untouched, frozen in virtue, a relic. There's even a lesser-known detail in some folk-tale versions, where the princess is found with fresh roses laid on her chest every spring, though no one can explain how they got there. A reminder, perhaps, that time continues to care for her, even as it forgets the castle around her. And yet, she remains voiceless, unaware. She sleeps while the world builds a legend around her. People debate her beauty, her fate, her future, but never her thoughts. No one asks if she dreams, or what she might have become had she been allowed to grow up without interruption. Still, the tale moves forward. A young prince, his name rarely mentioned, comes upon the tale. Not by royal dispatch, but from an old man at a roadside tavern, or a wandering bard whispering over a fire. He doesn't seek glory. Or at least that's what the stories want us to believe. He simply listens, and something draws him to the forest's edge. And conveniently, the moment he arrives is the moment the curse expires. The thorns part like they were never meant to last. The wind stirs again. The fire crackles back to life. The guards blink. The leaf falls. He ascends the tower past sleeping maids, slumbering cats, the gentle hum of a castle remembering itself. And there she is, just as the story said. A girl seemingly asleep but warm. Her chest rising slowly. Her lashes still. A kingdom's heartbeat under her skin. What happens next varies. Some say he kneels beside her, simply watching for a while. Others say he's overcome by awe, by some unexplainable sense of connection. In most versions, he kisses her not with passion, but with reverence. And her eyes open. That's the moment everyone remembers. The kiss. The awakening. But perhaps more importantly, it's the first time she gets to choose anything at all. Her eyes meet his. She smiles. She stands. Together they walk down the stairs hand in hand. And as they do, the world follows. The court resumes its duties. The birds return to the sky. The queen breathes. The baker finishes his dough. The story begins again. And yet it's worth asking, what if the princess had awakened alone? Would the castle still have stirred? Would the vines have parted? Did the spell require a rescuer or just time? We rarely hear those versions, but somewhere in some lost telling, she wakes to the light filtering through the tower window and decides quietly to walk down by herself. But that's another tale. For now, we follow the familiar rhythm, the return, the joy, the wedding bells. The king and queen rejoice. The 13th wise woman remains absent. The roses bloom again. And in this chapter of the story, all seems well. The castle breathes. The people cheer. The girl who slept is now a bride. But behind the celebration, the deeper pattern still lingers. A curse avoided not through cleverness, but through obedience. A life delayed, then rewarded not with freedom, but with a hand to hold. You begin to see it, don't you? The outline of something beneath the surface. This tale, however sweetly told, carries more than dreams. And so the spell lifts, the castle stirs, and all the players step back into their places, as if nothing had ever happened. But something did happen, of course. Something immense. A century passed in the blink of an eye. The fire rekindled itself, but it had also gone cold. The cook picks up his spoon, but the stew has spoiled. The trees rustle again, but some branches have long since withered, even in the absence of time. Time has always been a trickster that way. It doesn't always leave footprints, but it never truly forgets where it's been. And the princess. She smiles, she speaks, she moves forward into her new life. But what kind of life waits for someone who has quite literally skipped over her youth? She fell asleep a girl. She awakens a legend. The world sees her as a miracle, but she hasn't had time to become a person. Her dreams, if she even had them, are gone now, scattered in the folds of 100 unmarked years. Yet this is where most retellings end. The spell is broken. The wedding is held. The tale is sealed with a kiss and a crown. No one stops to ask what happens next. What happens to a girl who was frozen in time? What happens to the people who remember what she was, and now must adjust to who she is? What's often overlooked is just how strange that sleep really was. 100 years. A number that in folk tales doesn't just mean a long time. It means long enough for the world to change completely. New languages emerge. Forests shift. Kingdoms rise and fall. The map redraws itself. And all the while the girl sleeps unaging, untouched, unknown. In the Grimm version, there's no mention of what the princess dreams about. No sense of interior life. She becomes an object of preservation. But in the more symbolic readings, her sleep is often interpreted as a period of transformation. Not just a delay, but a cocooning. A moment between innocence and awakening. Between being a child and being seen as a woman. This is not a uniquely European motif, by the way. Across many cultures, deep sleep is associated with transformation. In Hindu mythology, Vishnu sleeps between cycles of the universe, dreaming new worlds into being. In Native American storytelling, long sleeps mark the pause between spiritual trials. In each of these, the sleep isn't emptiness, it's preparation. But here in the story of the sleeping princess, the preparation seems to come without agency. She doesn't choose it. She doesn't guide it. It happens to her. Her sleep is imposed by fate, by a curse, by a momentary misstep. It's not a journey inward. It's a waiting room. There's one particularly quiet moment in some lesser-known retellings where a bird lands on the windowsill during her sleep. It sings. It waits. It flies away. Nothing changes. But the implication is soft and sad time may be still. But the world outside is not. The princess is stuck in place, but life hums on just out of reach. It's here in this prolonged stillness that the surrounding world begins to shift. The castle is overtaken by nature, not just vines and thorns, but moss roots, even silence itself. The brambles grow not as a punishment, but as a kind of shield, as if the earth itself agrees she shouldn't be disturbed, as if the curse has become sanctuary. Historians still debate whether this imagery reflects a fear of female power or a reverence for it. Some see the thorns as a symbol of punishment, a way to keep the princess isolated and powerless. Others see them as a form of protection, a natural boundary erected to shield her from those who might claim her before her time. There's something poetic in the way the castle becomes a rumor. Maps are redrawn without it. The road leading there becomes overgrown. Children hear whispers of a tower hidden in the woods, but no one can find it. The past has become legend, and yet the legend grows. Songs are sung, paintings are painted. Even the thorn hedge itself is said to have a will of its own. In some tellings it moves to ensnare the unworthy, tightening its grip around would-be rescuers. In others it softens for those with pure intentions. The vines become judge and jury. And so we return to the moment when the prince arrives, not as a hero necessarily, but as a witness to perfect timing. He steps forward the brambles part, and the castle reveals itself again. It's not just a rescue, it's an unsealing. The world, it seems, has finally decided the moment has come. Inside the castle, everything resumes as if paused mid-breath. The flames reignite. The servants pick up their work. Even the dogs finish their naps. No one remembers falling asleep. They simply continue unaware that they've stepped into a future 100 years ahead. The princess descends the tower hand in hand with the prince. There's no ceremony, no trial, no test. Just the return to motion, the gentle rejoining of life. But as she walks through the castle halls, there's a stillness that lingers behind her. A strange awareness that something has changed, not just around her, but within her. Because while she slept, the world dreamed around her. And when she wakes, she becomes part of that dream. A symbol, not just a person. She is the girl who waited, the girl who was chosen, the girl who survived time. But what's interesting is that the story doesn't ask how she feels about any of it. She's treated as precious, beautiful, even miraculous, but not as someone with questions. Not as someone who might have preferred to be awake for her own life. That's the quiet thread you start to notice as the story draws its curtain around her. She is passive. Kind, yes, lovely, yes, but silent. She speaks few lines, makes no decisions. Things happen to her around her for her, but never because of her. And perhaps that's what makes this story linger. It's not just a fairy tale. It's a reflection, a mirror held up to a time when stillness was mistaken for virtue, when silence was seen as sweetness, when waiting quietly, beautifully, obediently was the ultimate feminine ideal. It's at this point that many readers close the book. The spell is broken. The girl is awake. All is well. But you're not done yet. There's more to this pattern versions of the tale that came long before Grimm ever picked up his pen. Stories that weren't meant for children at all, but for grown people in candlelit rooms wondering what it means to sleep through your own story, and what it means to wake up only when someone else decides it's time. Let's take a deeper breath now, because we're about to step beyond the familiar parts. We've wandered through the rose-scented halls of the Grimm version, seen the vines, heard the silence, and felt the weight of that 100-year pause. Now, as we begin to explore what lies beyond this single tale, we'll find that Sleeping Beauty has older sisters, strange cousins, echoes in real history and forgotten folklore and in sacred myths. Some are tender, some are uncomfortable, all are revealing. The girl has awakened. But the questions she leaves behind are just beginning to open their eyes. The vines have parted. The castle is awake. The tale, at least in its grim form, is complete. But if you listen closely, if you lean in just a little past the closing page, you'll find that something lingers. Not a villain, not a monster. Just a thorn you missed on your first reading a question buried deep inside the hedge. Why were the thorns there at all? It's easy to say they were placed by magic, an extension of the curse. But magic always has meaning. And in old stories, nothing grows without purpose. So let's step back for a moment, not from the castle, but from the edges of the bramble. What were those thorns trying to protect? In most retellings, the Wall of Thorns appears shortly after the princess falls into sleep. It isn't summoned by anyone. No one casts a spell. It simply begins to grow. It starts with small vines climbing the gate, then thickens, rises, and eventually engulfs the entire estate. Centuries pass and the castle vanishes from sight, as if nature itself has taken pity on what lies within. In that sense, the thorns are not just a defense, they're a curtain. A way of keeping the world out, not just physically, but emotionally. A buffer between a painful truth and the eyes of those who might misinterpret it. Historians still debate the meaning behind this living barrier. Some see it as a metaphor for chastity, a common trope in medieval literature, where the female body is likened to a walled garden, beautiful, enclosed, and forbidden. Others interpret it as a symbol of protection, not punishment placed there by unseen forces, to keep the sleeper from being found too soon. There are versions of the tale, mostly from French and Catalan oral traditions, in which the thorns are described as having intention. They snare the unworthy. They draw blood from the arrogant. But for those with honest hearts and no ill intent, the thorns curl away, becoming flowering branches. In this view, the hedge isn't an obstacle, it's a test. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some Slavic variants, the hedge isn't made of thorns at all, but of sleeping animals. Wolves, birds, even insects, all frozen mid-movement, forming a protective perimeter around the castle, like an enchanted moat of life paused. If you look even further back to older, more pagan roots, you find another possible reading. The brambles represent the cycle of seasons, specifically winter. In ancient agricultural societies, winter was not a time of death, but of rest. The land would sleep under ice and thorn until it was ready to bloom again. The princess, wrapped in her 100-year rest, becomes a human embodiment of that seasonal rhythm. Folklore scholar Maria Tatter once suggested that the tale of Sleeping Beauty isn't about romance at all, it's about timing. The idea that life happens not when you want it to, but when it's ready. The hedge only parts when the moment is right. The princess only awakens when the world somehow aligns. And that brings us to the many who came before the prince. The story hints at them knights, who heard the legend, who rode out with banners, flying only to vanish into the thorns. They're not given names. Their fates are only whispered. Some say they perished. Others say they remained trapped in the brambles, asleep, dreaming of a girl they never reached. But these forgotten suitors serve a deeper function. They show us that the hedge isn't about strength or bravery. It's about readiness. You can't force your way through time. You can't storm fate. The princess doesn't need the first man who tries. She needs the one who arrives when the story is prepared to change. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That sometimes it's not about effort or merit. It's about waiting for the season to turn. And let's talk about the prince briefly. He doesn't fight dragons. He doesn't climb towers. He walks unscathed through parting thorns. His reward is not a kingdom won through battle, but a life joined at the right moment. The message is gentle but powerful. Not all victories are won with swords. Still, the presence of the thorns makes one thing clear. Someone or something didn't want the princess to be found too soon. This leads to one of the more intriguing interpretations of the tale. The idea that the thorns represent the world's discomfort with feminine transformation. That when a girl reaches the edge of womanhood, marked in this story by the spindle prick, she's immediately removed from the public world, sequestered, encased. Remember, the spindle itself is a symbol of both labor and maturity. To spin is to be productive, to contribute. But in this case, the moment she touches it, she is rendered inert. No longer a child, not yet an adult. The world around her can't process that shift, and so it pauses. There's even a psychological reading of the tale where the entire story is interpreted as a metaphor for adolescence. The thorns become emotional defenses. The sleep becomes internal withdrawal. The kiss becomes symbolic of emotional reawakening. An emergence not caused by someone else, but triggered by the passage of enough time. Some folklorists argue this is why the curse always comes from a woman, the 13th wise woman. She is not the villain, but the initiator of change. In many ancient cultures, older women were the guardians of rites of passage. They watched over births, over marriages, over deaths. Their presence at a child's naming ceremony was not ornamental, it was essential. And when excluded, they didn't just take offense. They disrupted the cycle. That's what makes the story so haunting. The thorn hedge doesn't just hide the girl. It hides the parts of growing up that people don't like to talk about. Uncertainty, change, pain. The world can't confront what she's becoming, so it covers her up and calls it a curse. But here's a softer way to see it. The thorns didn't lock her in. They bought her time. Time to rest. Time to grow without being watched. Time to dream in peace. And when that time was over, they opened not with fire, but with flowers. It's a beautiful image, isn't it? A girl sleeps behind a wall of wild roses. Not because she's forgotten, but because she's cherished. Not because she's broken, but because she's still becoming. And as we step out from the shadows of those twisting vines, you begin to see the story a little differently. The thorns weren't meant to harm. They were meant to say not yet. They were the guardians of a pause, a necessary stillness, a season of slumber that had to end, but only when everything, even the brambles, was ready to let go. And so it happens the moment everyone remembers. A kiss soft and sudden breaking through a century of stillness. In the most familiar versions of the story, this is where everything changes. The curse is lifted. The girl awakens. The world resumes. But you've already seen that Sleeping Beauty is no ordinary fairy tale. And this moment, it's not as simple as it's often told. Because the earliest versions of the tale, the ones whispered long before they were ever written down, don't describe this awakening with romantic flourish. In fact, some don't describe it at all. You see, in Charles Perrault's version, the one that shaped much of modern Western retellings, there is a kiss. It's quiet, respectful, and somehow fated. The prince leans in and the spell ends. There is no consent, no conversation, no tension, just a seamless lifting of time, as though the kiss itself were simply the turning of a key in a long-forgotten lock. But in the Grimm's Little Briar Rose, something else happens. The princess wakes up as soon as the prince enters the room. That's it. No kiss. No contact. Just presence. And suddenly she opens her eyes as if she had been waiting not for love, but for someone to arrive at the right moment. For a witness, not a rescuer. That version oddly feels more respectful. The prince doesn't cause the awakening. He just happens to be there when time resumes. He doesn't do anything. He just sees. Folklorists still debate the meaning of this difference. Was it a moral correction by the Grimms? An attempt to sanitize earlier versions that might have been darker or more ambiguous? Or was it a return to a gentler form of storytelling? One that removed the sense of physical intervention altogether? Either way, the core question remains what really woke her up. Some versions say it was fate, that the curse was designed to end after 100 years, regardless of who showed up. The prince was merely punctual. Others suggest that the awakening was not about the princess at all, but about the world around her. That once the outer world was ready, once the thorns had softened, the wind had shifted, the balance had returned, then she could wake. Not by touch, not by love, but by time. And there are even more ancient roots to this idea. In early Indo-European mythology, the awakening of a sleeping maiden often coincides with the renewal of spring. In these stories, the girl represents the dormant earth, and the man, sometimes a god, sometimes a hero, represents the sun or the returning warmth. The moment of awakening isn't personal. It's seasonal, symbolic, a turning of the wheel. In some Persian versions, the heroine is awoken by a jewel placed in her hand. In Baltic tales, it's the sound of birdsong. In one old Greek version, never widely circulated, it's not a man at all who wakes her, but a burst of golden light streaming through a window, like Apollo's chariot passing overhead. All of which suggests that the kiss, as romantic as it may seem now, was never really the point. The point was change. The princess fell asleep because she reached a threshold, a spindle, a prick, a moment of transformation, and she wakes up when that transformation is complete. Not in her body, perhaps, but in the world around her. That's the more tender way to see it. Not as a rescue, but as a rhythm. It's worth noting, too, that in many cultures, kisses themselves are symbolic gestures, not necessarily romantic. In ancient rites, a kiss could mean blessing transfer of spirit or acknowledgement of transition. Priests kissed icons. Soldiers kissed swords. Parents kissed their children's foreheads before rites of passage. So perhaps the kiss in some versions wasn't about love at all, but about recognition. Even the imagery of the kiss echoes older spiritual traditions. In Catholic hagiography, saints are often kissed by death, meaning they pass gently into the afterlife with divine grace. In pagan rituals, the earth is kissed by rain to mark the changing seasons. These aren't gestures of ownership, they're signs of transformation. But let's return to our sleeping princess for a moment. When she wakes, she speaks very little. In most versions, she simply smiles, stands, walks, joins the prince. Sometimes there's a wedding, sometimes a feast. Rarely is there a question. Rarely is she asked, "What did you dream? How do you feel? Are you ready?" That silence is telling. Because while the moment of awakening is visually rich, roses, blooming birds, singing candles, relighting, it's also narratively thin. It focuses on what's seen, not what's felt, on action, not thought. And that may be the most lasting legacy of the kiss. Not that it wakes the girl, but that it defines her return to the world as a moment of being seen, of being beautiful again, alive again, claimable again. This is where things get quietly uncomfortable, because throughout literary history, beauty has often been treated as justification for stillness, for control. A woman who is lovely is expected to remain lovely, to rest, to wait, to not disturb the image. Sleeping Beauty becomes the perfect metaphor for this. A woman so beautiful she is preserved, frozen, unchanging. She doesn't resist the curse. She doesn't fight the thorns. She simply sleeps and is rewarded by being adored the moment she opens her eyes. There's a darker undercurrent here, but we're not going to linger on it. Instead, let's ask, what if the kiss meant something else entirely? What if it wasn't about possession or even awakening? What if it was about permission? A moment where the princess consciously or not allowed herself to return, to breathe, to rejoin a world that had tried to keep her out. Because even in silence there is strength, and even in stillness there can be choice. In fact, some feminist retellings of the story have reframed the kiss, not as an awakening imposed, but as a signal from the princess herself, that she was ready, that she had waited long enough, that the kiss was not the cause of her waking, but the response to it. A mutual moment, quiet and powerful. And there's one last detail worth noticing. In certain Italian folk tales, after the girl wakes, she isn't immediately grateful. She asks questions. She wanders the castle. She speaks to the servants. She learns what has passed. And only then does she choose what to do next. That moment of inquiry, however small, shifts everything. It gives her agency, voice. Because waking up is not the end of a story. It's the beginning of a new one. And so the kiss, whatever form it takes, becomes not a conclusion, but a threshold, a way of marking that the world has changed, and the girl is ready to step into it, no longer as a sleeping figure, no longer as a dream, but as a person, one who deserves to be asked what she wants next. The princess is awake now. The sun filters through the high windows of the castle once more, but she hasn't aged a day. Not a wrinkle, not a strand of hair out of place. She opens her eyes, radiant, immaculate, as if time itself had stopped not just around her, but within her. This detail, so often glossed over, reveals something ancient hiding inside the tale. A sleep so perfect, so untouched, it preserves not only beauty but body. The kingdom may have frozen, but it was her stillness that was truly sacred, and that notion, that preservation of the flesh equals purity. That belief didn't begin with fairy tales. It came from centuries of deeply rooted religious and cultural traditions. In medieval Europe, particularly within Catholic belief systems, there were stories of holy women, often nuns or martyrs, whose bodies did not decompose after death. These women were said to have lived such virtuous lives that even nature refused to touch them. They were called incorruptibles, and their remains became objects of pilgrimage. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles just to glimpse these women, sometimes displayed in glass coffins. Skin pale but whole eyelids, gently closed lips, still curved in a faint smile. One of the most famous examples is Saint Bernadette of Lourdes. She died in 1879, but her body was exhumed decades later and found remarkably intact. Today she rests in a glass shrine in France, her face serene, her hands folded in prayer, her presence ghostly but pristine. Her body has drawn millions. Some find peace. Others find something harder to name, a quiet sense of unease. Historians still debate the true nature of incorruptibility. Some believe these bodies were naturally preserved through environmental conditions, dry tombs, cold air, sealed sarcophagi. Others insist there's more at play, a sign of divine grace. And then there are scholars who ask a different question. Why is it always the women who must remain perfect in death? It's an uncomfortable pattern. These preserved bodies, like Sleeping Beauty, are admired, not for what they did in life, but for how still they remain in death. They become symbols not of action, but of suspension, not of power, but of pause. There's something eerily similar in the way the sleeping princess is described. In nearly every version of the tale, her beauty is emphasized not just as remarkable, but as unchanged. 100 years and not a single blemish. She doesn't decay. She doesn't shift. She remains the ideal, untouched, unspoiled, and above all, silent. It's this silence that reinforces the symbolism. A woman preserved is a woman untroubled by the messiness of life. No childbirth, no aging, no hunger, no voice. She's beauty, frozen in time, made holy by her stillness. Just like the incorruptibles. Even stranger. In some folkloric variants, Sleeping Beauty's bed is described in religious terms. A canopy like an altar, a chamber like a chapel. The princess herself resting with hands folded, bathed in a soft glow. It's no coincidence that these echoes feel sacred. They're meant to. And here's your quirky tidbit in a 14th century French manuscript version. Of the story, the princess is said to have a breath so faint it could not disturb a feather, and yet her cheeks remained flushed like the petals of a spring rose. That level of poetic observation mirrors the way hagiographers describe saints, every detail infused with symbolic grace. Even her breath is calibrated not to disrupt the world. This leads us to a deeper tension running through the tale, the idea that the ideal woman is the one who does not change, who does not age, who does not decay. The sleeping girl becomes less of a character and more of a shrine. She doesn't live so much as wait. She doesn't grow so much as remain. Scholars have long argued over whether this is a reflection of society's discomfort with female autonomy, a kind of cultural preference for women as eternal girls, beautiful, passive, and conveniently quiet. By keeping her asleep and unchanging, the tale avoids confronting what she might become if allowed to live on her own terms. But the image of perfect sleep, unchanging, eternal, also speaks to a universal longing, the desire to freeze a perfect moment, to stop time at its most beautiful. In that way, the sleeping princess is not just a symbol of control, but of human fragility, a hope that we might somehow preserve what we love before it slips away. This impulse exists far beyond fairy tales. In Victorian England, families often took post-mortem portraits of deceased loved ones, especially children posed as if sleeping, dressed in finery surrounded by flowers, their faces peaceful. These images were not seen as morbid. They were seen as comfort, proof that love outlasted life. Sleeping Beauty embodies this same emotional logic. She doesn't just represent purity, she represents preservation, a promise that some things might remain untouched by time, that a girl can fall asleep in one century and awaken in another without having lost her shine. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Real life doesn't work that way. People change. Bodies age. Time leaves marks. And pretending otherwise can be its own kind of cruelty. Still, the fairy tale persists. And perhaps it persists not because it tells us what women should be, but because it reveals what society has long wished they were: eternal, gentle, contained. And yet maybe there's another way to read her stillness. Maybe her perfect sleep wasn't a prize but a protest. Maybe by refusing to decay, she resisted being forgotten. Maybe she carved out a space in the collective memory not as a saint, not as a possession, but as a reminder. That stillness can hold meaning. That rest can be powerful. In that light, she's not just a beautiful girl in a tower. She's a pause in history, a breath held, a silence waiting to be broken, not by a prince, but by her own return. And when she rises flawless as ever, she doesn't need to explain herself, because her presence says everything. She is still here. The world has resumed its gentle hum, but she hasn't changed at all. You glance at her, this princess who slumbered 100 years, and what strikes you first isn't the serenity. It's the stillness. Not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle around her eyes. Her skin is luminous, untouched by time, with a breath so soft it could pass unnoticed, and yet there she is, as if the years tiptoed around her reverent, as if nature itself conspired not to touch her. This idea that a woman could sleep for a century and emerge just as beautiful as the day she was cursed might seem like a fanciful detail, just another embellishment in a fairy tale. But it carries with it echoes of something much older and far more sobering. Because long before Sleeping Beauty's grace storybooks, there were tales, real ones, of women whose bodies did not decay. Women who even in death were expected to remain perfect. We begin with the Incorruptibles, a class of Catholic saints. Many of them women whose bodies were exhumed years, even centuries after burial, and found to be mysteriously intact. Not embalmed, not mummified, simply preserved. Their skin supple, their features serene, as if holiness could hold back the forces of rot and time. Perhaps the most well-known is Saint Bernadette of Lourdes, a French peasant girl who claimed to have seen visions of the Virgin Mary in 1858. She died young at age 35. When her body was exhumed 30 years later, it was found to be remarkably unspoiled. No signs of decay. Her skin pale and whole. Her clothes unstained. Today, her remains lie in a glass coffin in Nevers, France, on public display for pilgrims who kneel not in horror, but in awe. Her face is now covered with a thin wax mask to protect it, but her hands folded in eternal prayer are her own. And Bernadette is not alone. There's Saint Catherine Labouré, also in Paris, and Saint Zita of Lucca, patron of domestic workers, whose body has rested peacefully in the Basilica di San Frediano for over 700 years. Each case is revered as miraculous proof, Some say of a life so pure that even death showed mercy. But scholars are not in full agreement. Historians still argue whether these women's preservation was truly divine or simply the result of fortunate burial conditions, sealed tombs, cool climates, and dry stone. A natural mummification, perhaps. Science explains a great deal. Yet somehow the myth always lingers. Because these incorrupt saints were not just admired for being holy, they were loved for being unchanged. Their stillness became sacred, their silence profound. They did not rise to preach. They did not lead armies or write gospels. Their bodies immobile, unblemished were the message. A still, lovely woman resting in peace. And now you see the resemblance, don't you? Sleeping Beauty lying on her embroidered bed surrounded by rose vines, and Hush begins to look less like a fairy tale princess and more like a reliquary, a preserved figure, a shrine. In some versions of the tale, this comparison is not accidental. One 16th century Italian variant refers to the girl's chamber as a holy place, and her posture hands folded over her chest as that of a sleeping angel. In a French manuscript from the 1300s, her complexion is described as clearer than ivory flushed like wine left in the sun, and her breath so faint it would not ruffle a candle's flame. These aren't just pretty images, they're liturgical ones. She's not just asleep, she's beatified. Even the setting supports this idea. Her bed is often described with canopy drapes, silken hangings, stained glass filtering soft light echoes of a chapel. Her attendants sleep like acolytes, the silence reverent, the air suspended. The tale begins to shift from fairy tale to vigil. And here's something you may not know during the Victorian period. Post-mortem photography became a popular, if morbid, way to remember lost loved ones, especially children. Families would pose their deceased kin in lifelike positions, seated, reclining sometimes, even with eyes painted open. These photographs were not considered ghoulish. They were seen as comforting, a way of preserving not just the memory but the appearance of the person before loss took its toll. Sleeping Beauty feels like a fictional reflection of this impulse. She lies in state, untouched, as though her story exists to soothe us with the illusion that beauty, youth, and innocence can be frozen in time, that nothing precious ever has to fade. Of course, this idea that the ideal woman is one who does not change is not unique to this tale. Throughout much of Western history, female beauty was defined not by vitality, but by stillness, by softness, by a kind of ornamental silence. Think of the portraits of noble women from the Renaissance. Alabaster skin, downcast eyes, lips gently closed. Or the wax figures in historical museums, so perfect, so lifeless, so admired. In literature, too, this pattern emerges. Women are often most beloved when they are still sleeping, dying or dead. Juliet in her tomb, Ophelia in the stream, Eurydice in the underworld. The image is always the same beauty frozen, voice absent. And in fairy tales, these ideas were passed along quietly like lullabies. A beautiful girl sleeps. A man finds her. She wakes or doesn't. But either way, she is loved because she is unchanged, because she waits. Some scholars have pointed to this motif as part of a larger cultural discomfort with female agency, a narrative preference for women who are quiet and controlled. Sleeping Beauty becomes the ultimate symbol of this, a girl made perfect, not by what she says or does, but by what she withholds age, opinion, motion. Even her awakening, as we saw earlier, is not something she chooses. In most versions, she doesn't ask to return. She simply does. Her role is to receive, to be beautiful and available. But let's take a breath here, because while all this may seem discouraging, it also gives us an opportunity, a chance to look at the tale through another lens, one that doesn't just critique but reimagines. What if her perfect stillness wasn't a flaw, but a form of quiet defiance? What if by refusing to age, to speak to decay, she carved out her own kind of power? What if her long sleep was not just enchantment, but resistance, a way to preserve herself until the world was finally ready to listen? There's an old Spanish saying, "He who sleeps does not sin." It's often used to describe innocence or escape, but in this context, it takes on new weight. Maybe the princess chose on some subconscious level to remain untouched, to step out of a life she never controlled and into a silence that was hers alone. And when she woke, she did not scream, she did not flee. She rose graceful, intact, watchful. That too is a kind of strength. You see, preservation is not just a physical condition. It's an act of memory, of being remembered exactly as you were not, as the world tried to reshape you. And perhaps the tale of Sleeping Beauty endures, not because it tells us what women should be, but because it whispers beneath the thorns about how hard it is to be seen for who you really are. And here's one final image to leave you with. In some small churches across Europe, hidden in glass cases lie the mummified bodies of anonymous girls. No names, no stories, just preserved forms in faded dresses, ringlets curling behind waxen ears, fingers folded in eternal grace. Tourists pass them by. Locals light candles, and sometimes just for a moment someone lingers, not because of who the girl was, but because of what she reminds us, that even in stillness, there is presence. So too with our sleeping princess. She may not have spoken, she may not have aged, but she endured. And in doing so, she became more than a symbol. She became a mirror reflecting the delicate balance between reverence and restraint, preservation and possession. And she's still there in your mind, isn't she, lying in her chamber, unchanged, unasked, watching the world turn, waiting not for rescue, but perhaps for recognition. A silent presence who, without moving a muscle, still commands the room. She lies there, eyes newly opened, but the silence hasn't quite left her. Even as the castle stirs awake, fireplaces, rekindled courtyards, swept birdsong, seeping back into the morning air, she says nothing. She rises when guided, she smiles when seen, but she speaks, not a word. And perhaps that's the most curious thing of all. You followed this princess through curses and thorns, through sleep without aging, through the peculiar reverence of stillness. But now that the spell is broken, now that the long wait is over, where is her voice? Across nearly every version of the Sleeping Beauty tale, from Charles Perrault's 17th century version to the later Brothers Grimm adaptation, and even in many folkloric variants, there is something conspicuously absent. The girl at the center of the story does not choose who wakes her. She does not ask to sleep. And when she wakes, she simply accepts. In the earliest known literary telling of the tale, Giambattista Basile's Sun Moon, and Talia, written in the 1630s, Talia is the sleeping maiden. She is not kissed to awaken. She remains unconscious while others make decisions around her, even after she gives birth while still asleep. When she finally wakes, she's told what has happened, and she accepts it. No protest, no refusal, only a silent nod, and the story marches on. Now that version is deeply unsettling to modern ears, and with good reason. But even when later versions soften these elements, removing certain motifs, trimming away the more troubling implications, what remained was still a quiet girl surrounded by people who decide her fate. That silence is not coincidental. It reflects a much older pattern in storytelling, a tendency to portray ideal femininity as quiet, compliant, and graceful, but not vocal. The princess's role was to be the object of action, never the origin. Something beautiful to be found, not someone who finds. Historians and literary scholars alike have noted how Sleeping Beauty represents what some call the passivity archetype in fairy tale tradition. She is the one who waits. Snow White sleeps. Cinderella endures. Rapunzel remains in her tower. The heroine's worth is often measured not by her choices, but by her patience, her ability to withstand, to survive, and to remain desirable through it all. And of course, this isn't just a fairy tale phenomenon. For centuries in real history, women's voices were often dismissed, controlled, or outright silenced. In many noble and royal households, girls were educated not to lead, but to be led. Letters from the 15th and 16th centuries often advise young brides not to speak unless spoken to. Silence was praised as a virtue, especially in upper-class circles. A quiet woman was considered wise, a talkative one distrusted, criticized, or worse. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau once famously wrote that a woman's greatest quality was modesty, and that to please us she must allow us to believe that we are stronger. Silence then became a performance, a tool, a survival tactic, or in stories like this one, a defining feature. In Sleeping Beauty's case, her silence doesn't just highlight cultural norms, it transforms her into a kind of canvas. Because she doesn't speak, others project meaning onto her. The prince believes she's his destiny. The kingdom treats her awakening as a miracle. And she adjusts. Even in the beloved Disney adaptation from the 20th century, one that many remember fondly, the princess named Aurora, has only 18 spoken lines in the entire film. She is on screen for less than a third of the movie, and yet she remains the title character, not for what she says, but for what she symbolizes. It's a strange kind of fame, isn't it? To be known not for voice, but for silence, not for choices, but for being chosen. But what if we listened more closely? What if the tale's enduring silence is not simply a void, but an invitation? A pause asking us to reconsider what makes someone worthy of attention. Of storytelling, in some lesser-known modern retellings of the story, authors have tried to give the princess her voice back. In Jane Yolen's poem, Briar Rose, the girl wakes on her own terms. In Robin McKinley's Spindles End, the curse is subverted, and the heroine becomes her own rescuer. These reinterpretations don't reject the original tale, they expand it. They let the silence echo a little longer, and then fill it with something new. Even in historical reality, we find examples of women who reclaim their narratives after long periods of forced quiet. Take Christine de Pizan, a 15th century writer often credited as Europe's first professional female author. After her husband's death, instead of retreating into expected mourning, she wrote powerful critiques of misogyny and composed The Book of the City of Ladies, envisioning a world where women's stories were not only heard, but honored. Or Marguerite Porete, a mystic whose book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, defied both church and gender norms. Though she was eventually executed for heresy, her words lived on, smuggled and copied, whispered and remembered. Her silence imposed by fire could not erase her voice. And here's your quirky tidbit. In one obscure variation of the Sleeping Beauty legend, collected in Eastern Europe during the 1800s, the princess awakens not from a kiss, but from a book placed on her chest. The book contains stories of brave women from history. As it rests over her heart, she stirs, opens her eyes, speaks a single sentence I remember. No prince, no romance, just memory and recognition. It's a small story barely remembered today, but it offers a hint of what might have been, what still could be. A version where awakening is not about being chosen, but about choosing to return. Because sometimes silence isn't submission. Sometimes it's waiting for the right moment to begin. And now, as we close the chapter on Sleeping Beauty herself, we do so gently, not with condemnation, not with mockery, but with reflection. Her stillness, her preservation, her silence, they all meant something. They reflected the world that shaped her, but they do not have to shape us. Tonight we leave the castle, We let her rest or rise or rewrite herself. And as we move into the and more portion of our story, we carry with us the questions she leaves behind. About beauty, about power, about the value of a voice, even when it's never heard. Beyond the thorns and towers, there are other women, real ones, legendary ones, lost ones, whose lives echo the same themes. Waiting, waking, wondering if they will be remembered. Let's meet them now. You've just emerged from the final thickets of fairy tale where magic and metaphor have danced together for centuries. But now, as the last petals of enchanted sleep fade, the path ahead opens into something stranger, because the boundary between legend and history is never quite as clear as we like to pretend. And as your mind still lingers in the dreamlike hush of Sleeping Beauty's untouched rest, it might surprise you to learn that a real-life queen once lay still for far longer than 100 years. Not in a cursed tower, but in the halls of England's greatest abbey, her body exposed to the curious, the reverent, and the downright inappropriate. Her name was Katherine of Valois, a French princess who became Queen of England in 1420 when she married Henry IV. Yes, the same one immortalized by Shakespeare as the victorious King of Agincourt. But her life didn't follow a fairy tale arc. After Henry's untimely death, just 2 years into their marriage, Catherine was left a widow at the age of 21, with a young son who would grow up to become the troubled Henry VI. And what happened after her death is what pulls her story into eerie parallel with the Sleeping Beauty tales we've just left behind. Catherine died in 1437, only 35 years old, and her funeral followed the pomp expected of a queen. Her body was placed in Westminster Abbey alongside kings and queens before her. In keeping with royal tradition, a wooden effigy was made to represent her in the funeral procession, a painted likeness dressed in lavish fabrics, and even fitted with a wig made from real human hair. This effigy, by the way, still exists today and remains one of the oldest surviving examples of its kind. But while the figure was carefully preserved, Catherine's actual body, curiously, was not properly buried, for reasons still debated by historians. Her remains were instead placed in a simple lead coffin, and then quietly forgotten. And so, as the decades rolled by, the abbey was renovated, expanded and changed. But Catherine's coffin remained largely undisturbed. Then, during the reign of her grandson, Henry VII, construction work led to her tomb being accidentally damaged. What the workers discovered shocked them. The upper half of her body had been remarkably preserved. Her skin, it was said, appeared smooth. Her features, though still and silent, looked almost lifelike, as though she were simply sleeping. Sound familiar. In a time when physical preservation of the dead was viewed through a spiritual lens, Catherine's condition sparked curiosity. To some it was a marvel, to others a holy sign, but to many Londoners it was just something to gawk at. Over the following centuries, Catherine's exposed remains became an increasingly odd part of English public memory. Her coffin was moved to an open viewing space within the abbey, where, yes, visitors could and did come to look at her. And then came the diary of Samuel Pepys. On his 36th birthday in 1669, Pepys, a naval administrator and notorious observer of all things strange, visited Westminster Abbey and recorded something startling. "I did kiss her mouth," he wrote after handling the upper part of Catherine's corpse. This moment, astonishingly casual in his diary, became infamous in the annals of English history. And yes, it's often cited in darker explorations of morbid curiosity. But the more haunting truth, Pepys wasn't the last. Throughout the 1700s and into the 1800s, Catherine's body remained on display. Schoolboys reportedly poked at her ribcage. Her teeth and bones went missing, taken it seems as souvenirs. And as late as the 1780s, travelers were still writing about seeing her remains, often describing her with that same strange Sleeping Beauty energy, pale, quiet, untouched by time. One writer even noted that the skin of her legs, still wrapped in cloth, felt remarkably supple. That detail sticks, doesn't it? Not decayed, not skeletal, but soft, as if once again the sleeping queen might wake. It wasn't until 1878 that Katherine was finally reinterred with dignity, but by that time portions of her skull ribs and arms had disappeared. No one quite knows what became of them. Perhaps they're still hidden in dusty trunks or forgotten drawers across England. So what does all this tell us? It would be easy to frame Katherine's story as merely grotesque, a macabre footnote in royal history. But it's more than that. Her extended posthumous presence in public space touches on a deeper, almost archetypal fascination, the beautiful woman in suspended stillness. Like the sleeping princess behind the thorns, Katherine was preserved, not just in body but in narrative, a woman whose silence was mistaken for mystery, and whose stillness was turned into spectacle. And here's your historical fact. Katherine's prolonged exposure in Westminster Abbey spanned over 4 centuries, making her one of the longest publicly visible human remains in European history outside of sainthood. This was not a saint's relic displayed for veneration, but the body of a former queen caught between reverence and voyeurism. The quirky tidbit, Katherine of Valois was the grandmother of Henry VIII. That's right, the man famous for breaking England from the Catholic Church and having 6 wives was the descendant of a woman whose afterlife became a sideshow. There's a dark symmetry to it. One ancestor shamed in death, another shamed in life. And neither, it seems, got to rest peacefully. Historians still argue whether Katherine's display was the result of deliberate neglect or a reflection of shifting attitudes toward death preservation and royal spectacle during the Reformation and beyond. Some argue that the Abbey kept her accessible as a quiet reminder of the divine right of kings. Others suspect it was simply a case of oversight turned tradition, as one generation passed the burden of responsibility to the next. But you might feel something else stirring in the folds of this story, a familiarity perhaps. Because whether it's a fairy tale maiden, hidden behind enchanted brambles, or a queen lying quietly beneath Gothic stone, the image of a woman in silent suspension has held power over the collective imagination for centuries. Why, maybe it's the illusion of control. A sleeping woman does not speak, does not refuse, does not demand. She is there to be found, to be interpreted, to be possessed, until at last someone deems her fit to awaken. The stillness becomes the story, and the story becomes the myth. Of course, Katherine's life before death was far more nuanced. As a young widow, she likely fell in love with a Welsh courtier named Owen Tudor, and secretly married him, though some debate remains as to whether the marriage was ever formally recognized. Together they had several children, one of whom became the father of Henry VII. It's a quiet romance that shaped the entire Tudor dynasty, yet another woman's chapter often left in the margins of history books. Her final resting place may have taken centuries to secure, but Katherine of Valois' legacy endures in more than just Tudor bloodlines or faded funeral effigies. In the strange hush of her long slumber, unblessed, undisturbed, and very much on display, we glimpse a bridge between story and history, one where a queen rests not behind a veil of ivy and roses, but beneath the vaulted ceilings of England's most sacred space, while footsteps echo above her in the Abbey aisle. And now, with the soft stone of Westminster receding behind you, the path grows broader. Because Katherine's strange vigil was not the only case of stillness, mistaken for sanctity. All across Europe, and even beyond stories, have been whispered for centuries about women who did not decay, whose bodies remained whole, sweet-smelling, untouched by time. Next, we step quietly into those candlelit chapels, where incorruptible saints seem to rest in grace, and where beauty, real or imagined, is preserved not by magic, but by belief. The air feels different now, quieter, heavier, as though you've stepped not into a storybook, but into a place where whispers carry farther than footsteps. candlelight flickers on ancient stone, the scent of wax and incense clings to the arches above you, and silence feels almost sacred. You're no longer in a royal chapel or a fairy tale court. You've entered the relic chambers of Catholic Europe, where death isn't just mourned, it's displayed, venerated, and sometimes left remarkably untouched. Because for centuries the Church has preserved the bodies of certain women who, according to belief and tradition, showed signs of what came to be called incorruptibility. No embalming, no mummification, just preservation. Skin intact, features soft, sometimes even a faint scent of flowers. These weren't tales told to children, but testimonies recorded by priests, pilgrims, and physicians alike. And if Sleeping Beauty had been born in medieval Europe, she wouldn't have needed a spindle or a curse. She might have simply been a saint. One of the most famous cases is Saint Bernadette Soubirous, a 19th century peasant girl from Lourdes, France. She claimed to have seen visions of the Virgin Mary, and after her death in 1879, her body was exhumed first in 1909, then again in 1919 and 1925. Each time officials were stunned. There was no visible decay. Her skin appeared smooth, her hands folded gently over her chest, just as they had the day she was buried. Today, Bernadette lies in a crystal coffin in the town of Nevers. Her face and hands are now lightly coated in wax, partially for protection, partially to restore color, but her body beneath remains startlingly intact. Visitors stream through each year, marveling not just at the preservation itself, but at what it symbolizes: purity, faith, and the quiet reward of a holy life. But Bernadette's case isn't unique. In Italy, there's Saint Zita of Lucca, a 13th century servant girl whose mummified remains are displayed in a glass coffin at San Frediano Basilica. Her body rests in a sort of peaceful collapse, head gently tilted, robes long faded to ivory. In Portugal, Saint Elizabeth of Aragon lies in a golden tomb, her skin darkened by time, but her features preserved. And in Spain, Saint Teresa of Avila's heart, yes, just her heart, is said to have resisted decay and is now kept as a separate relic, a piece of a life held in a gilded shrine. Now, to modern ears, this might sound macabre, but in the medieval and early modern mindset, incorruptibility wasn't about horror, it was about hope. It was a sign of divine favor, a reward for a life lived in humility and devotion. The Church never officially labeled incorruptibility as a miracle in itself, but it was often considered supporting evidence in canonization. If a woman remained whole in death, perhaps it meant her soul was unblemished too. And that's where the connection to our Sleeping Beauty deepens. Because in both tales, one sacred, one folkloric, the woman is untouched by time. Her body is preserved. She lies still in peace while others gather to view, reflect, or be awed. The difference in the case of the saints, she is not waiting to be awakened by love. She is believed to already dwell in eternal union with God. Here's your historical fact as of today. More than 100 canonized women in the Catholic tradition are believed to have shown signs of incorruptibility, though only a portion remain on public display. These women came from all social ranks: nuns, queens, servants, mystics, and their preserved states are documented in official church investigations, complete with eyewitness accounts and autopsy reports. Your quirky tidbit. In 1591, St. Katherine of Valois, a poor Clare nun, was found to have not only remained incorrupt, but also assumed a sitting position in death. Her body still rests today upright in a chair inside her convent, holding a crucifix in her withered hands. Locals once believed she could grant wishes if you gently tugged at the hem of her robe. But there's more to this than preservation. Many of these women were not praised for loud declarations or daring acts. They were revered for stillness, obedience, and sacrifice. Like Sleeping Beauty, they were remembered less for what they did, and more for how they endured, how they remained, how they kept their silence. Historians still argue whether incorruptibility had natural explanations. Was it the burial conditions, the dryness of the tomb, the specific diets of the women, some of whom were nearly ascetic in life? In recent years, scientists have examined some of these bodies and found signs of partial mummification. Not miraculous, but remarkable. Yet even when science offers explanations, it doesn't always remove the awe. Because in the quiet alcoves of Europe's cathedrals, these women still lie beneath glass, their names inscribed in gold, their feet pointed gently toward the altar. Pilgrims still kneel, children still stare, candles still flicker in the half-light, and for many the presence of a woman who does not decay remains a mystery, or perhaps a metaphor, because whether in story or in shrine there is a long tradition of associating physical beauty, especially still silent beauty, with virtue. The less a woman changes, the more she was believed to be good. Unchanging skin became a symbol of unchanging heart, and what greater reward some believed than to be preserved forever. But it also raises quiet questions. Why were so many of these saints remembered for the lives they gave up, rather than the lives they lived? Why did stillness become the standard of sanctity? And what happens when we venerate women, more for their silence in death than their voices in life? Those aren't criticisms. They're reflections, ones the Church itself has wrestled with over centuries. And they echo softly through the narrative of sleeping beauty, where a woman's worth seems measured not by choice, but by patience. Still, there is something undeniably moving about the atmosphere in these places. Whatever your beliefs standing before a preserved body, a woman who lived, breathed, suffered, and then lay down to rest centuries ago can be humbling. You're not looking at a relic. You're looking at time paused. And so as we step away from the chapels and reliquaries, the theme continues to evolve. Stillness, sleep, preservation. Whether in legend or in church, the image endures. But next we'll turn to another kind of myth. Not one of saints or queens, but of gods. Because in ancient Greece, a young woman named Danae was locked away by her own father, not to preserve her beauty, but to stop her destiny. What happened next came through the ceiling. From silent chapels filled with flickering candles, we now cross into the brighter, wilder world of Greek mythology, a place where stories feel sun-baked, gold-drenched and slightly dangerous. The stillness of sleeping saints gives way to the hum of divine interference, and suddenly beauty isn't just preserved, it's pursued. Tonight you meet Danae, a princess, whose tale is less about slumber and more about imprisonment, and unexpected visitors from above. Long before fairy godmothers and enchanted thorns, Danae's story was already unfolding in the myths of ancient Argos. Her father, King Acrisius, had a problem not one of war or treasure, but of prophecy. An oracle had warned him that he would one day be killed by his own grandson. So naturally, he did the most logical thing a panicked ancient king could do. He locked up his only daughter in an underground bronze chamber to make sure she never had a child. Yes, really. No spindle, no dragon. Just a father, a jail cell, and an attempt to outmaneuver fate. This is your historical fact in classical myths. Confinement of women by fathers wasn't just a plot device. It reflected real Greek societal anxieties about female sexuality, inheritance, and control. Many women in myths were hidden, veiled, or enclosed to protect both their chastity and their family's honor. Danae's imprisonment was symbolic, but it echoed real-life practices like secluding high-born women in the gynoeceum, the women's quarters of ancient Greek homes. But of course fate in Greek mythology rarely stays locked out. While Danae sat alone in her bronze cell, cut off from the sky, surrounded by cold walls untouched by the world, someone else was watching. Zeus, king of the gods, noticed her. And in one of mythology's most surreal plot twists, he decided to visit. But not as a swan or a bull, or even disguised as a mortal. No, this time he appeared as a golden shower, a shimmering stream of divine gold descending through the ceiling of her prison, and settling gently over her body. Let's pause there for your quirky tidbit. This golden rain is one of the strangest divine disguises in all mythology. Ancient painters loved depicting it. Gold flakes drifting down into Danae's lap, sometimes into a bowl or onto her bed. Later, Renaissance artists made it even more elaborate. A room bathed in gold, Danae reaching toward the light, looking more mystified than surprised. It was interpreted as seduction divine will, or celestial intrusion, depending on the era and the artist. And what happened next? Danae conceived a son, Perseus, the future slayer of Medusa. Her father, of course, was not pleased, despite the fact that Zeus, an immortal sky god, was responsible king Acrisius, blamed Danae. He had mother and child placed in a wooden chest and cast adrift at sea. And again, this mirrors a theme you've seen before. A woman with no say in her fate, passed from one cage to another, her silence shaping the story more than her speech ever could. Historians still argue whether Danae's tale was originally a metaphor for agricultural fertility, or a coded myth about royal succession and divine lineage. But regardless of its origin, one thing remains consistent. Danae is acted upon, not acting. She is hidden, visited, exiled. Like Sleeping Beauty, she does not choose the moment of transformation. It simply happens to her. But unlike Sleeping Beauty, Danae doesn't sleep. She waits. And in the Greek view, waiting was often what women did best. The myth continues with Perseus growing up to become a hero, rescuing Andromeda, founding cities, fulfilling prophecies. His deeds become legendary. Danae. Her story quietly disappears. Once her womb has fulfilled its role, the myth fades her out, like the credits rolling on a silent background character. And that perhaps is the quiet tragedy behind both myth and fairy tale. The women at their center are rarely permitted to grow. Still, there's something haunting about Danae's golden moment. She doesn't fight. She doesn't flee. She simply receives. And whether you interpret that as surrender, awe, or resignation, it's the stillness that lingers. The image of a woman alone in a sealed room illuminated by something she cannot stop. Modern scholars have re-examined Danae's myth through a variety of lenses: psychological, feminist, symbolic. Some argue it reflects a fear of female agency, wrapped in divine packaging. Others see in it a strange kind of cosmic longing, the idea that even locked away from the world, beauty calls the heavens down to earth. And perhaps more softly still, Danae's tale reveals something else. That transformation, whether through sleep light or love, often comes without invitation. And for women in these old tales, it rarely asks permission. But even so, Danae's golden visitor sets something powerful in motion. Her child becomes legend. Her body becomes canvas. Her name, though nearly voiceless in the myth, outlasts entire generations of kings. And so the pattern continues, a woman enclosed, her stillness interpreted, her silence filled in by others. But what happens when a woman is not just locked away, but placed into magical sleep, surrounded by fire, guarded by fate, and waiting not for a god, but for a hero? Next we turn northward to wind-swept cliffs and blazing rings of myth. There another sleeping maiden awaits the warrior princess Brunhilda, asleep not in stillness, but in flame. By now your mind might be settling into the rhythm of these stories, tales of sleep silence, and the fragile threads of fate, wrapped around the lives of women who didn't always get to choose their stories. So let's stay a moment longer in this strange half-dream, but shift the scenery. No longer nestled in candlelit chambers, or drifting through ivy-covered towers, you now find yourself on a rocky, wind-scoured mountaintop. The air is thinner here, sharper, and in the distance, curling upwards like the breath of an ancient beast, you see a ring of fire that never burns out. This is where the legend of Brunhilda begins, or more accurately, where her sleep begins. She isn't a princess, Nor is she particularly quiet or passive. In fact, she's a warrior, a shield maiden, a figure of strength and vengeance from Norse mythology, wrapped in iron and willpower. And yet, like Sleeping Beauty, her story still ends temporarily in enchanted slumber, locked away behind thorns of a very different kind. In the Völsunga saga, a cornerstone of Norse legend dating to the 13th century, but pulling from much older oral traditions, Brunhilda is one of the Valkyrie's mythical female warriors who choose which soldiers die or survive in battle. She defies Odin, the chief god, by choosing the wrong man to save. That act of defiance costs her dearly. As punishment, Odin strips her of her immortality and casts her into a deep magical sleep on the highest mountain. Around her, he conjures an eternal wall of flames, and then he leaves. This isn't a fairy tale with roses and lullabies. It's thunder and steel and punishment. And yet the parallels to Sleeping Beauty are impossible to ignore. A woman in suspended animation, a man who must brave great danger to reach her, and always the idea that her life and future are tied to a single fateful kiss, or in this case an awakening from one deemed worthy. The fire Odin conjured wasn't just metaphorical. It burned in every retelling. Only a man truly brave, braver than any who came before, could pass through the flames. And eventually one did. Sigurd, a heroic figure in Norse mythology, known for slaying dragons and navigating curses, stumbles upon Brunhilda's mountaintop prison. He rides through the flames not by luck, but because of his unmatched courage. And when he finds her lying in full armor with her sword at her side, he does not kiss her. Instead, he removes her armor, piece by piece. Not gently, not like a prince in a child's story, but methodically, like one warrior recognizing another beneath the layers of battle. She awakens. Now, depending on which version of the saga you're reading, and there are quite a few, their story from here shifts dramatically. In some, they fall in love. In others, Sigurd forgets her, enchanted by another. In some, she becomes a tragic figure bound to betrayal. But what remains constant is this: Brunhilda, like so many before her, was silenced by punishment, locked in sleep, and woken by an external force. What makes this story particularly fascinating is how scholars interpret it. Unlike many earlier tales where women are passive from the start, Brunhilda begins with agency. She makes decisions. She takes sides. She defies authority. Her punishment then is sleep, a form of immobilization, not unlike imprisonment. And this is where myth bleeds into metaphor. Historians and literary scholars often debate whether the enchanted sleep in these myths represents more than just magic. Could it symbolize the way strong women were culturally silenced when they stepped outside the roles society allowed them? One mainstream interpretation suggests exactly that. The Valkyries, after all, weren't just fantasy figures. They embodied ideals of independence, martial skill, and divine favor. But Brunhilda's punishment reduces her from divine chooser of the slain to a prize behind flames, a passive sleeper awaiting a man's bravery. The transition is stark and telling. This dynamic appears again and again in mythology. And while Norse culture celebrated warrior women more openly than many others, even their tales showed what could happen when those women defied the wrong god. Now for a tidbit, one of those oddly specific details that scholars and storytellers alike find too peculiar to ignore. In some folk retellings, particularly those influenced by later medieval romanticism, the fire surrounding Brunhilda's mountain was said to whisper. Yes, whisper. Supposedly, if a traveler stood close enough to the blaze without stepping into it, they could hear voices warning them, luring them, or sometimes even mocking them. The fire wasn't just a barrier of heat, it was sentient, alive. It chose who could pass. This embellishment isn't in the original sagas, but like many folk tales, it crept in with time. A poetic touch, perhaps, to give even the flames a voice, when the woman at their center had none. And what of Sigurd? His journey through the fire was often interpreted not just as a test of courage, but as a metaphor for transformation. The flames purify. Only the worthy emerge on the other side. This mirrors a common theme across mythological traditions, that access to love power or truth requires some form of trial, and often it is the woman who waits while the man is tested. There's another curious parallel here. Some scholars point out that the ring of fire surrounding Brunhilda isn't just an obstacle, it's a symbol of fate. In Norse mythology, fate isn't changeable. The Norns, female beings who weave the fates of gods and mortals alike, are ever present in these tales. Brunhilda's sleep, her awakening, even Sigurd's path through the fire, all are woven long before the story begins. Some interpretations even suggest that the entire saga was never about choice, but inevitability. Historians still argue whether the character of Brunhilda was based on a real historical figure. There was indeed a Brunhilda of Austrasia, a 6th century Frankish queen known for her fierce political maneuvering and turbulent reign. She was imprisoned, slandered, and ultimately executed in a way that shocked even her enemies. Some believe that echoes of her life, her strength, her fall, her punishment, bled into the myths over time. But this remains speculative. The mythological Brunhilda as we know her today is more warrior than queen, more immortal than mortal. As the wind howls around this imaginary mountaintop and the fire flickers in the distance, you can't help but feel the weight of all these layered meanings. Brunhilda's story isn't a gentle fairy tale. It's forged in heat and loss. And yet at its heart it still asks the same question that Sleeping Beauty's tale whispers. What happens when a woman loses control of her own story? She is placed in stasis, surrounded by danger, and her fate is decided by who dares approach. Yet there's something quietly subversive about the Brunhilda version. Because she wasn't always asleep. She was fierce. She made choices. She fell into slumber as a punishment, not a flaw. And when she woke in some versions, she demanded answers. She didn't just smile and marry the man who woke her. She questioned everything. This retelling, one layered with fire war and consequence, offers a darker, richer take on the sleeping maiden theme. It challenges the idea that women are waiting to be chosen. It remembers that before the sleep came defiance, and that sometimes the hardest part isn't the sleep, it's waking up to a world that expects silence. As you gently descend from that mountaintop, the flames still burning faintly behind you, a cool breeze picks up. The fire is behind you now, but the questions linger. And just ahead lies another tale, not of warriors or gods this time, but of something far more ordinary and unexpected. Because in our next story, it won't be a hero or a prince who stirs the sleeping figure, but a baby. A tiny accidental act. And as we'll see, sometimes the smallest hands can bring about the biggest awakenings. In the hush that follows mythic slumber and heroic rescue, you find yourself drawn to the quieter versions of the tale, the ones that don't always get retold. Not every sleeping beauty is awakened by a gallant prince, charging through brambles, or a warrior stepping past walls of fire. Sometimes history and folklore whisper of a much softer interruption, one brought not by sword but by the smallest tug of life itself. And as strange as it sounds, it is the innocent gesture of a child that shifts the entire weight of the story from timeless passivity to something stirring, unexpected, and profoundly human. There exists a variation of the Sleeping Beauty tale where the savior is not a nobleman, not even fully grown, but rather a newborn. This alternate thread, still tethered to the woven fabric of fairy tales, opens quietly. The young woman lies in an enchanted sleep, unmoving, untouched by time. The spell that binds her is deep, complex, and symbolic, but not eternal. Instead of waiting for a kiss, her awakening comes by accident. A tiny infant, one of the twins she has given birth to in her slumber, seeks nourishment, latches onto her hand, and unknowingly sucks the enchanted splinter from her skin. Just like that, the magic is undone not by romance or destiny, but by instinct need and the quiet urgency of survival. You might pause here, puzzled by the implications. Twins birth sleep. How does that all align but the story as recounted in Basile's 17th century Italian folktale Sun Moon? And Talia builds itself on the blurred edges between sleep and death agency and passivity. Though the origin of these twins remains deeply problematic in earlier versions, something we've chosen to respectfully exclude for this storytelling purpose. The child's role in awakening is what stands out here. It isn't the prince or king that breaks the curse. It is the child in one simple unconscious act that shifts the tide. That moment softens the harshness of older versions and replaces it with something quieter and more palatable, a symbol of new beginnings. Historically, children in folklore often represented change, not in a grand destiny-fulfilling way, like in epic myth, but in subtler, more tender metaphors. In medieval Europe, infants were not seen as passive background characters. Instead, they were tiny omens, often viewed as bearers of truth, catalysts of transformation, or even guardians of family fate. In some folktales from France and Spain, children born during lunar eclipses were believed to hold the power to end curses or reveal hidden truths. Their presence was not simply about continuation of lineage. It was the universe nudging change into motion. In Sun Moon and Talia, the splinter embedded under the sleeping maiden's nail is the physical remnant of danger, of a curse unfulfilled. And the baby, entirely unaware of this drama, merely seeks comfort and nourishment. The act of dislodging the splinter isn't heroic in the traditional sense. It's mundane, instinctual, and purely human. But its outcome reverberates in unexpected directions. Talia awakens not to the world she left, but into motherhood, responsibility, and confusion. She doesn't gasp awake into a perfect scene with roses and birdsong. She wakes into life with all its messiness, uncertainty, and strange beauty. And here's where things get even more curious. In some regional adaptations, like later Neapolitan retellings, this act is described with a slightly different twist. The child doesn't merely dislodge the splinter. Instead, the baby's tears, hot and sudden, fall onto the mother's hand, washing away the poison. While there's no clear historical evidence to support that as a widespread version, it captures the emotional truth of the moment in a way that's almost poetic. Pain awakens love. Sorrow brings forth clarity. What this suggests symbolically is powerful. The curse isn't broken by grand gestures or brave declarations. It is undone by something small, natural, and deeply tied to care. In a world where most sleeping beauties are passive recipients of fate, this version tilts the lens. It hints that perhaps change doesn't always thunder in like a night. It creeps in softly with the weight of an infant's cheek, or the flutter of breath on a mother's hand. A curious tidbit here tucked away in obscure 19th century folklore collections from rural Germany describes a folktale with a nearly identical scene. But instead of a magical sleep, the woman is paralyzed by grief. The child, born posthumously, never cries for the first 3 days. Then suddenly, as the grieving relatives prepare for burial, the baby wails and the sound breaks the woman's paralysis. Scholars argue whether this story is derivative of older Sleeping Beauty variants, or simply a cultural echo, a storytelling pattern that emerges when societies try to process loss and rebirth. But either way, it emphasizes something profound. The simple act of presence, especially a child's, can stir the heart back to life. Now, if you look closely, this motif of the child as savior isn't exclusive to European folktales. In certain Japanese legends, there are stories of mothers who died during childbirth, but whose infants in their hunger and cries awakened ancestral spirits, who then revived the mother. In Central African storytelling traditions, it is said that newborns are still close to the otherworld, carrying with them memories of past lives or blessings from spirits. So when they cry unexpectedly, or reach for someone who seems unreachable, They may be acting as a bridge between worlds. That bridge, as it appears in these tales, is never heavy. It is gentle, often accidental, and always intimate. Returning to Talia's tale, once she awakens, she finds herself in a room filled with uncertainty. The twins beside her are not just a mystery. They're proof of time, lost of life, continuing even without her conscious permission. And yet, instead of descending into despair, her narrative arc begins to climb. She chooses care. She embraces the unknown. In some later versions, she names the children sun and moon, not out of whimsy, but because they represent the passage of time. She missed the daylight and night that slipped by as she slumbered. This poetic naming serves as a tender reminder that even in stories rooted in old patriarchal structures, women's resilience and transformation are possible even when they don't choose the moment they wake up. The role of the children continues to ripple through the folklore even after the initial curse is lifted. They become symbols not just of innocence, but of unintended power. In fact, in some lesser-known adaptations from Portugal, the child who awakens the mother is said to carry a blessing mark, a faint golden thread-like birthmark that protects them from harm. In one story, this child grows up to become a wise healer who can soothe sleep disorders in others simply by touching their forehead. Though that tale veers more into the magical, it reinforces how deeply embedded the idea is that children bring with them unseen forces, and that sometimes those forces are what set the old stories back into motion. Historians still debate whether these versions were ever widely told or merely scribbled into marginalia by imaginative collectors. Some say they were invented as cautionary tales. Others believe they were softened revisions of harsher originals, retooled for gentler audiences. But one thing is certain in a world where most women in stories were expected to wait for permission to live, these baby-led awakenings offer something quietly revolutionary. It shifts the agency, if only slightly. The woman doesn't choose to wake, but the child doesn't choose either. The change comes from something almost beyond intention, an event born of care-hunger connection. It's not about control. It's about the inevitability of life pushing forward, even through silence and stillness. As you lie there now, imagining the dim room with its carved stone windows and soft morning light, picture the scene not as a dramatic re-entry into the world, but as a mother stirring to find a warm weight curled against her chest, a heartbeat other than her own, and perhaps a tiny instinctual cry that feels like the first sound in a world long paused. It's not a trumpet or a sword. It's a whisper of breath, and it changes everything. So yes, sometimes fairy tales end with weddings and feasts. But other times they begin again with a single accidental touch, one that rewrites the rules and gently reminds you that healing doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in the arms of the smallest person in the room. And just as that image settles softly in your thoughts, the story continues, now reaching into the broader echoes of history, where beauty, stillness, and silence weren't just literary tropes, but burdens placed upon real women across time. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How something as fleeting as beauty can become the weight a person carries for life. You've seen her before, not just in stories, but in sculptures behind velvet ropes and cracked portraits, tucked away in chilly museum halls and dusty folk tales whispered down centuries. She's always there, the beautiful girl, the lovely wife, the fair daughter, frozen in place, stilled often not by her own choosing, but by the gaze of others. In this section, you'll follow a trail of how beauty and myth and history shifted from being a gift to becoming a kind of gentle prison. You're still drifting in the afterglow of the last story, where the child, the newborn, brought life back to the world with something as simple as an accidental gesture. But here, the power dynamic tips again. This time, we return not to innocence, but to the burden of appearance. And not just in fairy tales. Beauty, once praised as a divine blessing, slowly began to act more like a cage, one lined with lace and gold, sure, but a cage nonetheless. Consider the case of Simonetta Vespucci. Her name may not echo like Cleopatra or Helen, but in Renaissance Florence, she was the woman artists couldn't stop painting even long after she was gone. Born in Genoa in the 15th century, she married a cousin of the famed Amerigo Vespucci and became known as La Bella Simonetta. Botticelli, yes, the one behind the Birth of Venus, painted her as the goddess herself, flaxen-haired, serene, a vision of otherworldly allure. But Simonetta died young, likely of tuberculosis at just 22. And here's the haunting tidbit. It's said Botticelli requested to be buried at her feet, despite never being her lover nor her husband. Decades after her death, he still saw her not as a person, but a symbol, an eternal muse, an idea. In many ways, Simonetta became a real-life sleeping beauty. Not asleep in a tower, but sealed in time forever, young, forever admired. The beauty that drew so much devotion also erased her story, her voice, her fears. No letters from her survive, no record of her thoughts. Just brushstrokes, just gazes. This phenomenon isn't isolated to art. In many ancient societies, beauty was often seen as a form of power, but it was rarely one the woman herself controlled. In ancient Rome, for example, the Matrona, a respectable Roman woman, was expected to project modesty, dignity, and physical attractiveness all at once. But not too much. A Roman writer named Juvenal warned men that a beautiful wife would bring trouble. He said men were foolish to marry women who caught too many eyes because they'd never rest easy, always fearing seduction, betrayal, or worse. And so women found themselves walking a delicate tightrope, praised for their loveliness, blamed for the reactions it stirred in others. The irony deepens when you look at how beauty and stillness were tied together. A lovely woman, history often suggested, was one who did not speak too much, did not act on her own, did not move outside of the frame she was placed in. Like the fairy tale princesses, like Simonetta, like so many royal women whose portraits were commissioned not to capture their personalities, but to broadcast their desirability and obedience across dynastic lines. A particularly striking example, the Spanish Habsburg court. Known for their austere, almost chilling portraits, think of Velázquez's famous paintings of the Infanta Margarita Teresa, wide-skirted, rosy-cheeked, with eyes that seemed to plead and hide all at once. She was promised in marriage almost from the moment she could walk, her beauty monitored like a political asset. Her dresses were built to widen her frame artificially, her waist cinched to impossible thinness, her skin powdered into ghostly perfection. She was praised not for what she did, but for how she looked standing still. And at just 21, she died exhausted from repeated pregnancies, from a life spent performing the part of the perfect princess. Historians still argue whether such portrayals were intended as celebration or quiet warning. Were artists honoring these women, or exposing the unbearable stillness expected of them? And yet this theme was not confined to Europe. In imperial China, beauty often came paired with silence. The famous four beauties of Chinese history, Shishi Wang Zhaojun Dayaochan and Yang Guifei, were so admired that legends grew around the sheer impact of their appearance. Shishi, it was said, was so beautiful that fish forgot how to swim when she passed. But in every tale, her beauty brought tragedy, political exile, war, betrayal. The lesson was unspoken, but clear: to be too beautiful was dangerous, not for the world, but for the woman herself. And somewhere in this cultural tapestry, the myth of sleeping beauty quietly persisted. Because in many of these stories, the perfect woman wasn't just beautiful. She was motionless, unaware, awaiting, like a statue that someone else could move or kiss or claim. Even in more recent retellings, you'll find the princess rarely has agency. She's dreamed about, sought after, awakened, but never consulted. That's not to say these stories were written with malice. Often they mirrored the realities of their time. In a world where women's lives were tightly controlled by fathers, by kings, by customs, it felt natural to tell stories where a woman's stillness was central, where passivity wasn't just tolerated, but celebrated. There's a curious tidbit about Victorian England that adds another layer to this. During the height of the mourning period for Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, the Queen began issuing royal portraits of herself in perpetual mourning attire. Artists followed suit. Suddenly, beauty was equated with pale skin, solemn expressions, even faintness. The consumptive look, thin and almost ghostly, became fashionable. Women were encouraged to appear delicate, fragile, untouched by the chaos of life. Sleeping Beauty once more. Even makeup trends followed this idea. Belladonna drops made from a toxic plant were used to dilate pupils, giving women a wide-eyed, dreamy expression. Aesthetic frailty became the ideal, but it came at a cost. Belladonna, as you might guess, was poisonous. Repeated use caused vision problems, hallucinations, and sometimes death. So what does it say about a society when its ideal woman is not strong, not active, but silent, and still even to her own detriment? Some modern scholars argue that these beauty ideals were never just about admiration. They were about control. A beautiful woman who also happened to be still, who didn't talk back, who didn't move beyond her appointed place was easier to own, easier to manage, easier to fit into a portrait or a marriage contract or a fairy tale. And here you are centuries later, still telling these stories, still captivated by the beauty asleep in the tower, by the face in the painting, by the sculpture behind glass. But maybe now you see her differently. Maybe you wonder what she thought as she stood still, what she dreamed of during those silent years. There's something hauntingly familiar about her, something that echoes even now when the pressures of beauty are less about arranged marriages and more about filtered photos and silent scrolling. But the result, sometimes stillness, sometimes the feeling of waiting to be noticed, to be chosen, to be deemed worthy. The story just looks different now. And maybe that's why the tale of Sleeping Beauty still holds power. Not because of the kiss, not because of the curse, but because it shows you what happens when a person is loved only for how they appear when they're not moving. You've wandered through portraits, palaces, and pages. You've watched beauty turned into burdened silence, mistaken for virtue. And now, as this section draws to a close, you find yourself not at the end of a story, but at the beginning of a question. What happens if she chooses not to wake up? What happens when beauty speaks? What if the fairy tale ends? Not with a kiss, but with a choice. The final section will be a quiet reflection on that very idea. You've traveled far from myth to monarchy, from ancient silk chambers to sunlit halls of Versailles, and the last stop is not a story at all, but a mirror. We're almost there. You might think by now you've heard all there is to say about Sleeping Beauty, about thorns and kisses, about quiet maidens and faded awakenings. But in truth, the real story has only just begun, because Sleeping Beauty isn't just one tale, she's a reflection. A delicate mirror held up to centuries of ideas about women, silence, beauty, and the mysterious pause between life and death. Let's return to the image that stayed with you, a girl on a bed, motionless, her skin unchanging, her breath almost undetectable. Not speaking, not aging, not choosing, just waiting. For something. For someone. In many versions of this story, she waits forever, until a man arrives to wake her. She doesn't decide to sleep. She doesn't choose to wake. In some tales, she doesn't even get to speak after it all. She simply becomes a symbol of purity, of beauty, of patience, of what it means historically to be ideal. And this pattern, it's everywhere. Across time periods and cultures, we find similar echo stories, where a woman's silence is prized more than her words, where beauty is her only power, and yet also her greatest danger, where stillness is synonymous with virtue, and where male figures are cast as the bringers of movement, action, and destiny. It wasn't just Sleeping Beauty. Take the silent woman trope in Elizabethan theater, or the countless unnamed muses in romantic poetry, or the paintings of the 19th century where women are captured mid-slumber, mid-gaze, mid-sacrifice. The more passive they appear, the more they're admired. Stillness becomes seduction, helplessness a kind of art form. In that way, Sleeping Beauty becomes less of a fairy tale and more of a cultural echo chamber. Her stillness is repeated, idealized, painted, rewritten. She is made passive so that others may act. She is silenced so that her surroundings can speak for her. The thorns don't just grow around the castle, they grow around her choices too. Historians still argue whether the endurance of this tale is due to its comforting familiarity, or something more complex, perhaps an uneasy resonance with deeply embedded norms. There's a quiet suggestion that even now our stories haven't changed as much as we like to believe. But what's striking is how the Sleeping Beauty narrative evolves. In newer interpretations, she speaks, she resists, she chooses. Modern retellings from literature to film have begun reimagining her, not as the girl waiting to be kissed, but as the one choosing when to wake. Some tales reverse the dynamic entirely, having the princess save herself, or even rescue the prince. The story is shifting, and slowly her silence is breaking. And this opens the door to a bigger question. How many other voices have been asleep in our stories, waiting to be heard? What about the women who never got their own version of the tale? The ones erased from their own legends? There were queens, warriors, saints, scientists forgotten or reduced to side characters. Stories polished into simplicity, their sharp edges dulled, until nothing remains but archetypes. Passive, perfect, pretty. But real history was never so clean. Remember Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who wrote theological treatises, designed a secret language, and composed hauntingly beautiful music, still performed today. For centuries, her story slept too hidden in monastic archives. Or take Artemisia Gentileschi, a Baroque painter, whose vivid works challenged gender norms of her time, yet was long overshadowed by the fame of male contemporaries. Her paintings full of defiant women are now celebrated, but for a while they lay dormant as if under their own spell. And in every corner of the world, there are folklores with sleeping goddesses, mourning maidens and enchanted women, waiting for fate to remember them. These are the stories we were never told, not because they weren't worth telling, but because they didn't fit the mold. Too complex, too powerful, too awake. In a way, our storytelling traditions put some voices to sleep, and it's only now centuries later that we're learning how to wake them up. Even fairy tales, as light and glittering as they may seem, have shadows. They were not born in nurseries, but in kitchens, courtrooms, and marketplaces. They were warnings, lessons, reflections. They were never only for children. That's why returning to a tale like Sleeping Beauty reveals more than just narrative nostalgia. It lets us glimpse what generations before us valued, feared, and hoped for, and how much of those beliefs still ripple through our own world. It's also a chance to ask, who tells the story and who gets to wake up? Because maybe the real magic isn't in the kiss or the curse or the 100-year sleep. Maybe it's in the realization that the stories we inherit don't have to stay frozen. We can rework them, rewrite them, let them grow wild again like a hedge of thorns opening back to the light. And you've wandered through this tangled forest of dreams and echoes of myths and memories, and now you've made it to the clearing. You know more than you did when you began. So as we close this final chapter, just take a moment to remember, stories are not just for sleep. They are also how we awaken. And now, as the last echoes of this tale soften in your mind, you begin to feel the weight of it settle gently like silk over your shoulders. You've wandered through hidden towers, forgotten tombs and whispered legends. You've met sleeping queens and saints who did not decay, ancient heroines and rewritten endings. You've seen how time changes stories, and how stories in turn shape the way we see time. What began as a simple tale, the one you may have heard as a child, has now become something richer, something stranger, and maybe even something more beautiful. Because the true power of a story is that it continues long after the final page, curling quietly into your thoughts, your dreams, your questions. If there's one thing to take with you tonight, let it be this: you are allowed to question the old tales. You are allowed to imagine different endings. And most of all, you are allowed to wake up. There is peace in sleep, but there is also grace in rising, in choosing, in rewriting the script. So rest well tonight, knowing that history is not just something behind you. It's something you carry with you in every story you choose to keep or change. The world is quieter now, the castle still, the thorns have parted, and in the hush that follows perhaps you hear it too, not a prince's footsteps but your own heartbeat. Sweet dreams,